I reached this next position against a very talented young player named Teodoro. It was played in the Enhanced International in the Marshall Chess Club in 1992. I was black, it was my move. This is pretty simple. If you've studied the other bishop endings, you have a sense for how to win a position where you have a superior bishop against an inferior bishop, or when you have bishops but you're up a pawn or two. In this game, I want you to just find the solution, black to move, to win in the easiest way. You have an outside passed a-pawn, you have two bishops against a bishop and knight. Good advantages. What should you do? First of all, obviously you see that queen takes b2 would be a terrible blunder, because queen d8 is checkmate. That would be a sad way to end the game. I traded queens. Queen takes d1, knight takes d1. The more you study the endgame, the more you'll just know. There are certain things which you'll need to calculate and certain things which you won't. You'll just know the answer by heart. This is one of those games. If the dark square bishop and the white knight weren't on the board, the win would be completely straightforward. Black could put the bishop on b3, controlling the a4 and a2 squares, and then just push the pawn off the board. Make a queen. How can we do that? The key is to dominate the white knight. I play bishop d4. A very strong move, central, stops all the squares of the knight. In my annotated games I've also discussed this relationship between bishop and knight, where if the bishop is separated from the knight by 2 ranks or files, it can stop all of its movements in that direction. Here notice the knight couldn't go to b2, c3, e3, or f2 without coming under fire of the bishop. Also the white king can't enter the game because f1 is covered by the bishop, and he can't move the f-pawn to try to bring the king in because of the pin by the black square bishop on d4. So I'm dominating the knight. If the knight moves, then I'll take it, because we see that the bishop endgame is completely winning. Let's take a look at that. If he were to play knight e3, I could simplify the position. Bishop takes e3, f takes e3. Now usually you don't want to just give up the advantage of 2 bishops, but here it's a forced win. And now I would just play a5. He would have to stop that pawn's advancing by playing bishop c2. Then I could play bishop b5 to prepare a4. Then he brings the king. King f2. I play a4, king e1. He's not in the square yet, but he can get there. After a3, he plays bishop b3. Now I can't get to the a2 square, but what I can do is attack his kingside pawns and force a trade of bishops. Bishop c6 attacks the g2 pawn. My aim, of course, is to maneuver my dark square bishop to the e6 square, lining up with his. If his king can't help, then the bishop either has to trade or move out of the way, and I push with a2. If his king is close enough, though, he could play bishop takes e6, f takes e6, and then play king c3 to b3 and take the pawn. By playing bishop c6, I make this impossible. If he were to defend the pawn with the king with king f2, then bishop d7, followed by bishop e6, wins because the king is too far away. If he moves the white pawn to g3, then I play bishop d7 with tempo, attacking the h3 pawn. He plays h4, or g4 for that matter, and then I play bishop e6, and I win. His king is too far from the bishop. If he defends the g-pawn by moving it up 2 squares, then a number of things would win, but the most straightforward is to attack with bishop g2, h4, and then bishop h3. You can either bring the king to the queen side with king d2, after which I simply play bishop takes g4 and I'm up 2 pawns, obviously winning. Or you can make the move g5, defending, after which we've reached our aim of bishop e6. A forced win. Just so that we understand, if he were to play king d2, bishop takes g4, king c3, the win is straightforward. I play bishop e6, offer the trade. Obviously he can't accept it because I'm up a pawn on the king side as well. He has to move the bishop back to c2. And now his king is stuck defending the queen side, and my king can take its time playing king f8 to e7 to f6 to e5. I can play g5 whenever I want to. I'll win on the 2 sides of the board. He can't defend both. So we see that after bishop d4 dominating his knight, knight e3 loses by force. I could take it and win the bishop endgame. It's good to know these things. He tried to stop my a-pawn by playing bishop c2, after which I just maintained my bind, played a5. He blockaded with bishop a4, and now his bishop is relegated to passivity, blockading my a-pawn. His knight is dominated by my dark square bishop. His king can't come into the game because of my pin on the f2 pawn and my control of the f1 square. He's totally tied down, and all that's left is to bring the king. King f8. A I'm sure you know my next moves. My plan is king e7 to d6 to c5 to b4, kicking out his bishop, pushing my pawn. There's nothing he can do. If he tries to activate his king with, for instance, g3, king e7, king g2, king d6, king f3, I can stop everything with f5, and the king has nowhere to go. The e4 square is covered, the e3 square is covered, the e2 square is covered. My king comes in, king c5 to b4. We already know that after knight e3 that trade is winning for me. It's all over. He tried it as a last gasp to get the knight out, knight e3. You already know what I did. Bishop takes e3, f takes e3, king e7, king f2, king d6. He played e4, king c5, king e3, king b4, king d4. His final idea was to try to do something which wouldn't even work. If king takes a4, he wanted to play king takes c4. We know, of course, that after king a3, king c3, a4, eventually he will run out of moves and he'll have to give up that bind. But there's no reason to get into that. I played the simple move bishop b3, and he had to resign. If he trades bishops, then he can't stop my a-pawn, and if he moves his bishop, I simply play a4, a3, and a2. So this is an example of using your knowledge of the endgame to change the struggle from a double-edged game into a technical win. I knew that the bishop ending was winning, and so all I did was force the trade by creating a bind of my dark square bishop for his knight, so that the win was beyond question. Notice once again the theme of the active king. I can't emphasize it enough. The difference in this endgame was once again an active king versus a passive king. Play with the king in the endgame.